Chapter 2. The Roamer. In the morning, Lena woke early, pulled aside the curtain by her bed, and saw that the storm had passed. Her spirits rose. The Roamer would come. "Wake up, Poppy," she said, nudging her little sister. "We're going out this morning." Said Poppy into her pillow. "Yes," said Lena. "It's going to be exciting. Come on." She got Poppy up and dressed her, and by the time they were downstairs, the rest of the household was up, too. Mrs. Murdo stirred a pot of corn mush in the kitchen. "Maybe this Roamer will have some dried mushrooms," she said. "That would make a nice change. Or some barley. Or walnuts. Or just about anything different," said Lena, who spent way too much time helping Mrs. Murdo figure out how to make 2 potatoes feed 5 people and inventing endless dishes made from corn mush. "Or some of that willow bark tincture for pain," said Dr. Hester, who was stumbling around blearily, looking for a bag of herbs she'd left somewhere the evening before. "Yes," said Louis Harrow with a rueful grin. "Could have used that last night." "Jam!" shouted Torin. "If he has jam, let's get lots of it. I hate eating this icky mush without jam." They had a hurried breakfast, Dune's father spooning up his mush awkwardly with his left hand, since his right was encased in a bulky bandage. Dune looked as if he hadn't slept much, Lena thought. There were shadows under his eyes. Getting ready to go out took forever. Poppy spilled a big blob of mush down her front and had to be dressed all over again. Dr. Hester couldn't find her scarf. Torin was rooting around in his box of treasures, looking for something he said was extremely important. Finally, Dune caught Lena's eye and sent her a questioning look. She nodded. "Dune and I will just go on ahead," she said. "Okay?" Mrs. Murdo waved a hand at them. Yes, go on." So the 2 of them ran out into the windy morning. They headed down the river road and into the muddy streets of the town, where people were streaming toward the plaza to see the Roamer. A Roamer was a trader who traveled along the far-flung settlements and into the ruined places to collect goods to trade. The approach of a Roamer was always exciting, even at times like these, when people had very little to offer in exchange for whatever goods he might have. Roamers brought news from other villages. Crops might be having an especially good or bad year, or sickness might be rampaging, or rivers flooding, or celebrations planned. News came as well from the mountains and from the empty territories that lay between settlements. Roamers could tell people if ice had formed on the lakes, if the wild mushrooms were plentiful, or if there were rumors of bandits. At the very least, an arrival from elsewhere made for a change. "Let's get up close," Lena said. They edged around the side of the plaza and found a place near the strip of dead brown grass beside the river. Lena scanned the crowd. Somehow they all looked smaller than they had in the summer, as if they'd been shrunken and withered by the cold. They wrapped their arms tightly across their bodies and drew their shoulders up close to their necks. Their mouths were pinched, their eyes narrow and darting, as if on the alert for the next bad thing that might happen. Lena knew she looked that way, too. She had noticed in the mirror that the bones of her face looked sharper. She saw Mary Waters, one of the town leaders, gazing at the assembled people with serious eyes, like a mother worried about her children. She spotted her friend Lizzie Biscoe standing up on a bench to see out over people's heads. Lizzie had been ill. She was mostly recovered, but her red hair looked dull and tangled, and her face thin. She saw Kenny Parton waving at Dune and making his way toward them. He was a shy, quiet boy who seemed to amuse himself mostly by wandering around, noticing things. He had become a friend of Dune's toward the end of the summer, when something he'd noticed had given Dune an important bit of information about a treacherous young man named Tick. A few minutes later, Torin came running into the plaza like mad, holding something in front of him in both hands. Behind him, Mrs. Murdo bustled along, carrying a basket of dried garlic. They waited. People talked in low voices, shivering, breathing clouds in the cold air. They turned up their collars against the knife-edged wind that whistled around the corners of the shops. They pulled their hats and scarves over their ears. A great many of them coughed and wiped runny noses on their sleeves. The cold and damp had spread illness through the town, and illness took a harsh toll on people who were weak to begin with from having too little to eat. 3 people, so far, had died of fevers the doctor couldn't cure. Lena had watched through the back window of the house as their wooden coffins, 2 big ones and 1 very small one, had been carried toward the town's cemetery. Finally, a creaking and clanking signaled that the roamer was near. Lena stood on tiptoe, trying to see, but what appeared around the corner of the town hall was not quite what she had expected. For one thing, the roamer was a woman, a short, stout, ruddy-faced woman with hair like broom bristles, dusty yellow, chopped off roughly just below her ears. Her clothes were tattered and grimy, hardly more than rags stitched crudely together, lashed around with straps and cords from which hung a couple of knives and a battered tin bottle and a pair of scissors. She walked ahead of her wagon, carrying a long stick in one hand. The wagon was covered with an odd tent made of patches of different colors. All the patches were faded and dirty, but still the tent had a dull shine, like a cracked old raincoat. As its owner did, the wagon had things hanging off of it: pots and pans, cloth sacks and leather pouches, coils of rope, buckets. A few sheep shambled along behind, not white and fluffy, but gray as dish rags. The animal pulling the wagon was a kind Lena had never seen before. It was much more slender than an ox, probably too slender since its ribs showed in ridges along its sides. It had long, thin legs, a curtain of hair on its neck, and ears that pointed upward. It turned its long face to look at the crowd. "Hey, a horse!" said Kenny Parton, who was standing with Lena and Dune. "We hardly ever get to see them." She didn't know why, but Lena loved that horse as soon as she saw it. She had no idea what horses were like. Maybe they were terrible, savage animals. This one certainly looked strong enough to give a person a deadly kick. Maybe it would bite. It threw its head up all of a sudden and made a noise, and she saw its rows of teeth, but somehow she loved it anyway. The roamer had halted her wagon and was starting to speak. "Come in close," she cried. "Gather round. I have things to sell. High quality, unusual things. Bargain prices." People pushed up closer. "Look at my fine sheep," the roamer called. "I'm selling just one today." She turned around and hustled behind the sheep, shooing them forward. "Go on, lambies," she said, nudging their rear ends with her stick. The sheep skittered forward, bleating. "See how fat they are! See how healthy! Great for wool, great for tallow, great for stew." Even Lena, who was no judge of animals, could tell that these sheep were not especially fine. In fact, they looked rather ill. Their wool was matted, and their legs were dark with mud. "Who'll buy a sheep?" the roamer cried. "I'll sell one for 5 bags of corn, or 4 bags of beans. Make me an offer." No one spoke up. Sparks didn't have any bags of beans or corn to spare. The roamer scowled. "Come on," she yelled. "There's nothing wrong with 'em. You'd be a little grubby, too, if you'd been up in the mountains half the winter. Give 'em a good wash, and they'll be just fine." Still no offers came from the crowd. So the roamer shrugged angrily and reached into the back of her wagon. She brought out some bags and boxes. "All right," she said. "Other items of interest. Best offer accepted. Edibles especially favored. Also candles." One by one she held them up. There was a rusted bucket, a handful of old coins, a few straps and belts, a thick brown glass bottle. Hetty Carranza, standing next to Lena, sighed and shook her head. "This is the most pathetic batch of junk I've ever seen," she said. A few of the things found takers. Martha Parton offered a small jar of squash pickles for a battered cooking pot. Old Ferny Joe traded a sack of dried prunes for a carved walking stick. When the roamer held up a tiny plastic figurine, It seemed to be a little man with big muscles. Torin piped up with an offer for it, saying he had something extremely old and extremely special, a real remote with 14 buttons. But the roamer just flapped her hand, dismissing him. "Edibles, I said. Can't eat that useless thing." Torin frowned furiously. The remote was one of his treasures. He also had toy versions of a tank, a motorcycle, and an elephant. He had a non-working flashlight, and, best of all, he had 48 real light bulbs that his brother Casper had brought him from his roamings. He'd even seen it lit up once, when Dune connected it to the little generator he'd made. His light bulbs were his favorite treasure. He wasn't about to give them up. But he'd thought for sure he'd be able to buy something with the remote, which he didn't care that much about because he didn't really know what it was. Soon no more offers came from the villagers. People began to drift away, disappointed. The roamer, seeing this, banged her stick on the wheel of her wagon and raised her voice. "News!" she cried. "I've got 2 pieces of news. You can have 'em for cheap." Of course, everyone was interested in news. Usually roamers told the news for free, but this one clearly wasn't giving anything away. Mary Waters stepped forward and told her she could have 5 candles for her news. "All right," the roamer cried. Everyone grew quiet. "First thing is," said the roamer, "there's a pack of wolves in the area. I've seen the big birds circling, so keep a good watch on your sheep and goats." People frowned and murmured to each other about flocks and fences. Lena turned to Kenny. "Are wolves big birds?" she asked him. "Nope," he said. "They're dogs, sort of, only more fierce. They howl. It's like they sing together. In hard winters, they come in closer to where people live and they kill animals. People too, sometimes. Then the birds come in later to pick over what's left." With a shiver, Lena added wolves to her ever-growing list of the world's dangers. "Second thing is," the roamer was saying, jabbing a finger at the sky, "a new star is up there. It moves, is the odd thing about it. I've seen it myself." The villagers murmured a bit about this. Lena heard a couple of people saying they'd seen the same thing. "It's not right," someone said. "Stars shouldn't move." The roamer started putting her things back into their bags and boxes. "I know how you make a wolf-scaring whistle," Kenny said to Dune. "Want me to show you?" But Dune didn't answer. Lena saw that he was staring at something the roamer hadn't offered for sale. It lay near the rear wheel of her wagon. It looked to her like a flopped-open book lying on its face. The rest of the crowd left, and Kenny wandered off too. Dune beckoned Lena to come with him and stepped up to the roamer. "What's that?" he asked, pointing to the book. She glanced back. "Oh, that," she said. "I use it for my fires." "What are you asking for it?" Dune said. She turned from her task of bundling and boxing. "You want it?" A gleam appeared in her eye. "Of course. It might be very valuable," she said. "Ancient as it is, discovered high up in the mountains under unusual circumstances." "Oh, I don't think it's valuable," said Dune. "I just happen to be a book collector. I could pay... let me see. I don't have anything with me right now," he said. "But I could get some..." He hesitated, thinking, eyeing the tattered book longingly. Lena could see that he wanted it. The book was a mess, falling apart, but she knew how Dune felt about books. She had an idea. "I'll buy it for you," she said to him. She turned to the roamer. "I'll give you a match for it." "A what?" said the roamer. "A match," said Lena. "You know, to make fire." She happened to have 3 of them in her pocket. She carried them around with her because she so often needed one, to light a candle, to light the fire in the stove, to lend to a neighbor whose fire had gone out. All the matches and sparks had been brought there by the people from Ember. To the villagers, they were wonderful things. The plan had been to save them for trading, to help buy food and supplies now that the town's population had grown, but when the cold weather came, people couldn't resist using matches to start their fires. It was so much easier than using the flintstones. Probably, Lena thought, the matches were nearly gone by now. The shepherd's eyebrows shot up. Really? I've heard of those match things, but I've never... Then she quickly put on her cagey expression again. I mean, really? You're offering me just one? For this extremely ancient and important book? I would think 3 would be more like it. Lena glanced at Dune. Never mind, then, he said. All right, the roamer said quickly. 2. 1, Lena said. That book is in terrible shape. She took a match from her pocket and offered it. The roamer shrugged and gave Dune the book, smirking, clearly thinking she had gotten the better deal. Dune picked up the book. Lena saw right away that it was in ruins. The roamer had torn out so many of its pages that the cover's edges clapped together. Some torn strips still remained near the book's spine, where the roamer had ripped pages out unevenly, but there seemed to be only very few pages left whole, and even those were stained and warped. That was a waste of a good match, Lena thought. Dune turned the book over in his hands and looked at its cover. Then he looked up at the roamer. You got this up in the mountains? Yep, right near it. She clapped a hand over her mouth and cackled. But he told me not to tell, she said between her grubby fingers. Near what? Dune demanded. Who told you not to tell? The roamer just grinned and shook her head. She tossed the last of her trading goods back into the wagon, and as she worked, she hummed a little tune, a tune that somehow sounded familiar to Lena, though she didn't know why. When the bags and boxes were all stowed away, the roamer took hold of the horse's harness. Wait, Lena said. May I touch that horse? The roamer looked surprised, but she nodded. Lena patted the horse's shaggy side, and it rolled its big eye at her and huffed gently through its black nose-holes. She combed her fingers through the tangled hair on its neck. She reached up high and stroked its soft ear. When he was young, said the roamer, I used to ride him. Ride? You mean you got on his back? Does he go fast? He used to, said the roamer, giving the horse a couple of pats. Faster than a bicycle? Asked Lena. The roamer laughed. Faster than the water in the river. Then she tugged the reins, and the horse picked up a lanky leg and started forward. The roamer, leading the horse, walked away. Her sheep straggled behind. Lena was about to say goodbye to Dune, but he took hold of her arm. Lena, he said, look at this. There was something in his voice that made her turn to him in surprise. He held out the book, showing her the cover. Directions for use, it said in large print. Use of what? Said Lena. I don't understand. No, look down here, said Dune, pointing at the smaller print at the cover's lower edge. Lena peered at it. For the people from M, it said, and then there was a blot of something on the last part of the word. But it didn't matter. She knew what the word was. She looked up at Dune, wide-eyed. Ember, they said, both speaking at the same time.